Hello and welcome to our new series on ASME B313. This series is intended for the people who are studying for AP ICP examination, especially for piping inspection, and also the people who just want to learn about the ASME B313 process piping code. In today's chapter, in today's video, we are going to start with chapter 1. The chapter 1 will lay down the scope and definitions of ASME B313 code. Again, we have already seen this in the introduction video that this code is generally going to be used by the manufacturers. Generally, this code will take a precedence when you are talking about new piping systems. But if it's an in-service piping system, then this will not be taking a precedence. But again, even if you are talking about in-service piping systems, some criteria are going to be same as the piping was manufactured newly. So generally the heat treatment criteria, generally the pressure requirement, the thickness requirements, the hydro test requirements, all of these things are generally going to be similar for in-service application, though which are for new service applications also. So in this case, scope and definition, the first thing we'll have to understand is what is an owner. Owner is basically someone whose piping system it is, or they can be an organization who are working with this piping system, or they can be someone who is directly in control of the piping system. So owner of a piping installation shall have the overall responsibility for compliance with this code and for establishing the requirements for design, construction, examination, inspection and testing that will govern the entire fluid handling or process installation of which the piping is the part. So generally the overall responsibility of piping system is going to lie with the owner, because understand this, okay? ASME does not have a stamping scheme for process pipes, that is B313 pipes. That means ASME will not designate manufacturers for making the process piping requirements. In some cases, ASME do provide certifications to the manufacturers, such as for pressure vessels you have U stamp, U2 stamps, for pressure pipings or for power pipings you have a PP stamp. All of those stamps are gained by the manufacturer by some auditing requirements or by some requirements that they comply, and an audit is done by ASME. But for process piping requirements, ASME does not give a stamping scheme or certification scheme. That means it is the responsibility of the owner to select a competent organization for his process piping needs. So at the end of the day, the overall responsibility of design, construction, examination, inspection and testing will generally going to be lying with the owner, because it is the responsibility of the owner to select a manufacturer who is going to be competent for his process piping needs, which will cover the entire, the owner is also responsible for designating the piping in category D, category M and high pressure and high purity services, and for determining if the specific quality system is to be employed. So again, it is the owner who decides that if the piping system is a category D service, depending on what kind of fluid is flowing inside it, if it's a toxic service or category M service, if it's a high pressure service or a high purity service. This designation is generally going to be provided by the owner. Okay. Then there are some requirements for the designer, there are some requirements for the manufacturer, and there are also some requirements for the owner's inspector. Now also, we have already said this, that there is no ASME certification scheme for process piping manufacturers. That means whatever the manufacturer makes or whatever the component manufacturer has made, that component has to be inspected by someone who is owner's representative. So owner's representative can be owner's own representative, or they can be under the payroll of the owner. Or if the owner does not have these kinds of personnel, they can consult or they can hire a third-party inspection agencies to act as an owner inspector for inspecting the process piping. So the owner's inspector is responsible to the owner to ensure that the requirements of this code for inspection, examination and testings are met. If a quality system is specified by the owner to be employed, the owner inspector is responsible for verifying that it is implemented. It is the intent of this code to set forth the engineering requirements deemed necessary for safe design and construction of the piping installations. This code is not intended to apply to operation, examination, inspection, testing, maintenance, or repair of the piping that has been placed in service. So this is not for in-service piping system. This is only for a newly constructed piping system. If this pipe goes to in-service, then API 570 is going to take precedence, because that code is going to be for in-service examinations or in-service inspections. Next is, metallic piping is not designated by the owner as category M, high pressure or high purity services. The code requirements found in chapter 1 to chapter 5 and the fluid service requirement are found in chapter 3, chapter 2 part 3 and chapter 2 part 4. That means if the owner has not designated a piping system as category M or high purity service or high pressure service, then it is going to be considered as a default category, and for that the chapter 1 to chapter 6 are going to be applicable. Okay. Next, for non-metallic piping systems, there is generally a different requirement that is given in chapter 7. For piping in the fluid service designated as category M, all requirements are found in chapter 8. So if the piping is designated as category M, then 1 to 6 has to be followed, plus the additional requirement of chapter 8 also has to be followed, which is generally for category M services. Same thing with some other service categories also. For piping in a service designated as category D, the piping elements restricted to category D fluid services are in chapter 1 through 7, as well as the elements suited for other fluid services may be used. For piping that is designated as high pressure service, all requirements found in chapter 9 shall be applied, and the designations are going to begin with letter K. For piping that is designated as high purity services, the requirements are found in chapter 9 and the paragraph designation begins with U. Next is code cases. So code cases are basically some modifications or some interpretations that has been done which are not part of the code, but they are supplement to the code. They can be considered as the code requirement because a committee ruled over them, and based on the specific interpretation it can be used. Code cases, ASME issue code cases that are applicable to this code. The code cases modifies the requirement of this code, are applicable from the issue date until the cases are annulled, and may be used only when approved by the owner. When so approved, the code cases shall be specified in the engineering design and become the requirements of this code. Okay, so whenever the code cases has been published, code cases are considered to be the requirements of this code, but they have to be approved by the owner, because owner is at the end of the day responsible. Scope: the rules for process piping code B31.3 have been developed considering the piping typically found in petroleum refineries, onshore and offshore petroleum and natural gas production facilities, chemical, pharmaceutical, textile, paper, ore processing, semiconductors and cryogenic plants, food and beverage processing facilities, and related process plants and terminals. So all of these services are going to be considered as process piping, which are going to be governed by this code, that is ASME B31.3. Content and coverage: this code prescribes the requirement for materials and components, design, fabrication, assembly, erection, examination, inspection and testing of the piping. The code applies to piping of all fluids, including, these are the services that are included in this: raw, intermediate and finished chemicals, petroleum products, gas, steam, air and water, fluidized solids, refrigerants and cryogenic services. So all of these are included or are in the scope of ASME B31.3 process piping requirements. Exclusions: there are some services that are excluded from the requirements of this code. So exclusions are: this code excludes the following piping systems: the piping system designated for internal gauge pressure at or above 0 but less than 105 kilopascal or 15 psi, provided that the fluid handled is non-flammable, non-toxic and non-damaging to human tissues as defined in 300.2, and its design temperature ranges from between minus 29 degrees Celsius to 186 degrees Celsius. Power boilers: so power boilers external pipeline. So power boiler's external pipeline is not covered in this code. There is a different code which is known as power piping code, that is ASME B313. So boiler external pipeline are not part of this code. There is another code for that. So power boilers in accordance with ASME BPVC section 1 and boiler external piping, that is required to conform to ASME B311. Tubes, tube header, crossover and manifolds of fired heaters that are internal to the heater enclosure, pressure vessel, heat exchanger, pump, compressor and other fluid handling or processing equipment including internal piping and connections for external piping. All of these are going to be excluded from the scope of ASME B313. Units, generally this is a American unit, so American units will generally be using United States customary units, but again conversion for SI unit is also given in most cases. So this is a diagram that basically illustrates what is going to be the scope of your ASME B313. So tubes, header, crossover and manifold of fired heaters internal to the heater enclosure are not covered by B313, but external to that is covered with B313. Same thing with power boilers. Power boilers in accordance with BPVC code section 1 is not the scope of ASME B313, but boiler external pipeline is required to conform to B313, but apart from that you can have a B313 that can be used. Packaged equipment piping will be considered to be process pipe. Pressure vessel, heat exchangers, pump, compressor and other fluid handling and processing equipment including internal piping and connections for external pipeline. So internal piping will not be the part of ASME B313, but the external piping are generally going to be the part of ASME B313 services. Then there are definitions. So definitions are basically self-explanatory. It has to be read once, but it is very self-explanatory. If you have any idea about the piping system, you'll generally understand what are these definitions. There is a huge paragraph for these, but read this once. No need to remember all of these things, but yes, these are very general definitions that are going to be used throughout this code. Then there are a lot of appendixes that are attached to this code. So appendixes are basically additional requirements or requirements that are not part of this code, but those are again sometimes mandatory requirements. So some tables are there. You also have some various quality control systems that are to be used. All of these are given in appendixes. There are a lot of appendixes here, but again for ICP examination appendix are not that important. Appendix A is somewhat important, but other appendixes are not important. But again there are a lot of appendix, which is true for almost all of the construction codes, because almost all of the construction code will have a huge number of appendixes for different scenarios. So these are the list of appendixes. So appendix A is generally going to be important for ICP examination because it provides us with allowable stresses and quality factors for metallic piping and bolting materials. Appendix B gives us stress tables. C is physical properties, E is reference standards, guidance, safeguarding, sample calculation, nomenclature, all of these things are there. In C, here you can see some things are written as requirements, some things are written as guidance, and some things are referred to as information. So requirements are basically going to be the minimum requirement that it is. That is, whatever is written in the requirement has to be followed very strictly. Guidance is just a recommendation that is provided by this code. Those are going to be the good practices that has to be followed, but they are not mandatory. Information is just an informative appendix. This means it does not need to be followed, but information will give you general information on how to approach some things which are given in information. So nomenclature is going to be information. What are some different nomenclatures for different areas on the piping system? It is just an information that is given. Okay. So that's it for this video. In this video, we have just seen the basics of the scope or the chapter 1 of ASME B313. We have seen what is ASME B313, what is the scope of ASME B313, what are some fluid services that are included and excluded from B313. We have also seen how it is structured. So generally it is going to be structured in different chapters, where chapter 1 to chapter 6 are generally going to be minimum requirements for most of the piping system, and if the pipings is designated as category M or high purity services or high pressure services, then some other chapters also needs to be referred. And we have also seen there are some of the appendixes that are going to be attached in this code, where some are going to be the minimum requirements, some are just going to be giving us a guidance or they are recommendations that are given, and some are just basic information that are given for different kinds of piping system. That's it for this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about design criterias and design requirements. In the next chapter, pressure design is generally going to be more important, but we'll talk about this in very much detail in the next video on our ASME B313 pressure piping series. Thank you.